House Russian Book Prize. The winner will be announced in May. And Dr. Plokhy has just learned that The Last Empire has been awarded the Lionel Gelberg Book Prize, a University of Toronto and Foreign Policy Journal joint book prize awarded to the best English language publication on international affairs. Congratulate him on that. It is my great pleasure to welcome to UNM today and to introduce to you Dr. Serhii Plokhy, who is talking on today. The title of today's talk is Who Killed the Soviet Union? Revisiting the Collapse of the USSR.
Thanks so much for such wonderful introduction, and thank you very much for arranging this visit. This is the first time that I'm here in Mexico. You live here in paradise. Take this from someone who just came from Massachusetts, especially this year. You can see or can't hear me? Okay, good. You can hear me. So it's a great pleasure to be here. It's also probably the first time maybe that I'm invited to a conference or becoming part of the conference dealing with security issues, and that is because I am a historian writing on different subjects but really not on contemporary affairs. And the book that I'm going to present today in very general terms was a book of history. It was a little bit, I was a little bit nervous when I started to write about that. Most of my books were on earlier periods. Even with the Yalta conference, all the participants were safely dead. So whatever I write, no one would actually stand up in the audience and say, you got that wrong. With the book on 1991, this is a situation when actually a lot of people, or most of the people who were there, who were participants, and that was really international story and international drama. So participants were not just in Moscow, in Kyiv, they were in Washington, they were in Albuquerque as well. So that was a little bit, again, for me, unfamiliar turf. But I didn't expect still that even book on recent history would become really so relevant, because I was writing it, turned the manuscript in 2013. It was not easy to find a publisher. The people were saying, well, that's ancient history. No one is more interested in the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the time the book was published in May of 2014 and hit the shelves of the bookstores, it was viewed and it was perceived, and I can say that on the basis of the reviews that were there, it was perceived as an introduction into contemporary events. And I reread that book and was really surprised myself to find out how many things, what was happening in '91, are relevant today, and actually the rust seeds of many of today's issues, troubles, potential solutions, they are there in 1991. What I will try to do within the period of time, I hope it will be something like 40 minutes, so that I would leave time for questions. I enjoy that part of the discussion and conversation much more than my lecture. You wouldn't believe I heard this lecture before. So really I look forward to the question and answer period. The question that I pose here is, who killed the Soviet Union? And what I will offer you is we'll walk through a number of investigative theories, and I will try to introduce the main historiographic approaches that exist today to the fall of the Soviet Union. And I will try actually to convert you to my faith and say that, okay, all of these theories that are out there are completely wrong. They misled the world, they can mislead you, and the only true one is mine, and we'll see whether it will work or not. So let's start with the first of those theories. I don't know whether you remember Anna Chapman, who made headlines, maybe, I don't remember, 4 or 5 years ago. She was part of the Russian spy ring that was uncovered by FBI. And again, eventually, she became a sort of celebrity here, but even more so in Russia. When she came back to Russia, she became a TV personality, and now on some leading channels, you can see this program, the Tiny Mira с Анной Chapman, Mysteries of the World with Anna Chapman. One of those Tiny Mira was about the collapse of the Soviet Union and disintegration of the Soviet Union. And the basic idea of that documentary that was shown was that it was the United States of America that conspired to destroy the Soviet Union, to dissolve the Soviet Union, that was a secret CIA plan. And then there was a special Harvard project that came together, and eventually they succeeded in achieving what they wanted. So the Soviet Union fell apart because that was the doing, and that was the design of the United States of America. I'm at Harvard since 2007. I keep looking for people who are part of that mysterious Harvard project, who could not just mastermind, but even predict that the Soviet Union would fall apart in '91. I still couldn't find one. But again, what we see here is one of the interpretations of the end of the Cold War, interpretations of the collapse of the Soviet Union that is popular among general audience, but also among some scholars as well. Well, the most interesting part is that it's not only Anna Chapman or viewers of the Russian TV who believe that it was the United States that killed the Soviet Union, but good part of the American public believes in that as well. And this belief that the United States won the Cold War by wiping out from the map of the world its main rival and causing disintegration of the Soviet Union, the start and the beginning of this narrative is really in the memoirs that were written by people like President George H.W. Bush, at that time head of the CIA Robert Gates, and a number of other members of administration. In historiography, that approach received the name of triumphalist history of the end of the Cold War. The most interesting part is the origins of that myth of America winning the Cold War by destroying the Soviet Union. The destruction of the Soviet Union was never American or anybody else's goal in the Cold War. But the origins are in TV address on the 25th of December of 1991, made by President Bush. That day, earlier that day, President Gorbachev stepped down as the first and last president of the Soviet Union. And the White House issued a statement expressing kind of a regret over the end of the political career of Gorbachev, and crediting him that he, together with American administration, worked together to actually ease the tensions and end the Cold War. A few hours later, the same text was reworked into the narrative of American victory, and looking at the resignation of Gorbachev as the sign of that victory, as a symbol of that victory. Well, we now know how it happened. The negotiation was over what will go and what will not go into that TV address was happening in the middle of the presidential campaign. And Bush was not doing very well mostly because of the economy. It had nothing to do with foreign policy. In terms of foreign policy, the administration had a number of major successes. And it was really overnight that the narrative of administration changes from the one that claimed, well, we really have very little influence on what is happening on the ground in the Soviet Union, to this approach claiming a victory, and claiming victory in directly in connection with the Gorbachev's resignation. Another theory, here is Boris Yeltsin at the time when he was the first secretary of the Moscow Party City Committee. Behind him is, of course, portrait of Lenin. And the narrative is that it links together not the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War like the two previous narratives, but the narrative of the end of communism and end of the Soviet Union. And the idea is that once Yeltsin suspended the activities of the Communist Party on the territory of the Russian Federation, that happened after the coup, after the August coup of '91, then there was nothing to keep the Soviet Union together because the party was allegedly that glue that was keeping all of that together. And again, that's something that certainly doesn't work when you look at what was happening in 1991, or even look at the leading figures in the August coup of '91 in Moscow. The organizations that remained to be all union or imperial were the army and the KGB, and they were running the show. The party by that time already lost its actual ability to keep anything together, including itself. The first were the Lithuanians, who before their independence in 1989 actually declared that the Communist Party of Lithuania was going its own way. The heads of the communist parties in other republics became the presidents, who were already playing their own games, and so on and so forth. So that's another kind of a false lead or narrative against which I was trying to develop my own argument. And last but not least, the belief that it's the personal relations between Gorbachev and Yeltsin that caused the fall of the Soviet Union. These relations were really awful. They were really very bad. They were certainly part of the story of the fall and disintegration of the Soviet Union, but reducing that to the relations between Yeltsin and Gorbachev also opens possibility for someone today thinking that, well, the Soviet Union fell apart because one was drinking too much and another was indecisive and they couldn't talk to each other. We can now look at that differently, and we can change that because we were just not lucky we got wrong leaders, or those leaders couldn't talk to each other. Now, that was, in terms of my research, most of fun, proving other people wrong. But they wouldn't publish the book unless you have your own argument and you want to say what, in your opinion, was the key story and the major reasons for the fall of superpower, major superpower, that was in Cold War with the United States of America for 40 years or more than 40 years. The disintegration of superpower that happened so peacefully, at least at that time. Now we see that that story is not over yet. At that time, it happened so peacefully. How could that really happen? Because the Soviet Union met the end which was negotiated end, the dissolution. It wasn't fought in the midst of a major war, either global war or war that would involve major republics. How did that happen? Well, my generally take on the history of '91 and attempt to put it into broader context are reflected in the title of the book. The title of the book is The Last Empire. And what I mean by that is that in the case of the Soviet Union, we see the heir of the last classic European empire of 18th, 19th, and the beginning of the 20th century. And that the Soviet Union dies, whether it was empire or not, there is still a debate and discussion, but it dies the death of empire. It disintegrates along the line that were drawn by ethnographers of the 19th century between Russians and Uzbeks and Ukrainians and others and so on and so forth. So I put, and my analysis is based on the proposition that what we see in the Soviet Union in '91 is the end of a long era of the 20th century history. There are many ways to look at the 20th century history and make sense out of it. One of it would be the struggle between liberalism and communism or fascism. Or there would be the two world wars and the Cold War, and so on and so forth. Well, for me, the easiest way to understand in terms of politics and geopolitics in particular what the 20th century was about is to compare the map of the world at the beginning of the 20th century and at the end of the 20th century. And from that point of view and from that perspective, what you see is that the 20th century is about the disintegration of the empires and emergence on their ruins, new and independent states. So I put the end of the Soviet Union into the context of the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, Habsburg Empire, British Empire, French Empire, Portuguese Empire, probably lost a couple of other minor, or maybe not so minor empires as well. But basically, that's one of the main themes and one of the main stories of the 20th century. And from that point of view, what happened in '91 in the Soviet Union fits well the general world history and the paradigm of the 20th century. Well, my story begins a few weeks before the coup in Moscow, August coup of 1991, with the visit of President George H.W. Bush to Moscow and to Kiev. In Moscow, he signed agreement on reduction of nuclear arsenals. And in Kiev, he gave a famous or infamous Chicken Kiev speech, in which he drew a distinction between liberty and independence. And the message basically was, that was a presentation of the new American policy toward the Soviet Union. And that policy was that the Baltic states have the right and should go, but the rest of the republics should stay as part of the Soviet Union. And that the Soviet Union actually would do better without Baltic states. Baltics should go, the other republics should stay there. Well, Bush met with the Gorbachev, of course. He met with the head of the Ukrainian parliament at that time, a figure who would play an important role in the story of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, Leonid Kravchuk. And he met also with the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. A few days before Bush's visit to Moscow, a very important meeting took place between Yeltsin, the president, and still he's now president of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, and Gorbachev, in which they decided, first of all, to remove the people who were at that time in the government as prime minister, as head of the KGB, as minister of defense, to replace them with their own people. And most importantly, they agreed on the basics of the new Union Treaty that was negotiated by Gorbachev. According to that new Union Treaty that was supposed to be signed on August 20th, 1991, all the rights for natural resources, and that means oil and gas, would now be transferred from the jurisdiction of the Union to the jurisdiction of the republics. That means that the Russian Federation, or for that matter Turkmenistan, would become the owners, the official owners of oil and gas, the main source of income and hard currency for the Soviet Union in 1991. Well, of course, the conversation was taped. People who didn't want to leave cabinets or offices of the head of the government, head of the KGB, launch revolt. And they are saying that they are trying to save the Soviet Union, which basically in historiography, the idea of that is rejected. But I look at their claim actually with more, I tend to take their claim more seriously. Because what you would see really with this new Union Treaty, if it would be signed, the Soviet Union, the way how it existed, would be gone. The Soviet Union, in which Russia and Yeltsin in particular would become much more powerful than Gorbachev, and the center would emerge. When the coup starts and begins, from that point of view, it's not a surprise that Boris Yeltsin, the person who had to gain the most from the signing of the new treaty, emerges as opposition to the coup. The coup leaders miscalculated. They thought that actually they could get Yeltsin on their side, and that's why they didn't arrest him. That's why they allowed him to come to Moscow, to mobilize people there, and so on and so forth, because they knew how bad the relations between Yeltsin and Gorbachev were. And the hope was that Yeltsin actually would never actually try to stop the coup against Gorbachev, that he would take a different path. Yeltsin refused to do that, and it was Yeltsin's resistance to the coup that led to its defeat. It wasn't the people who supported the Soviet Union and supported Gorbachev who defeated the coup, but those were people who united around Yeltsin and around the idea of New Russia, and this is one of the first appearances of the New Russian banner at that time. So the vision of the New Russia that defeated the coup. So the coup was defeated not by loyal Soviet citizens. The coup was defeated by the people, the citizens, for whom the idea, the notion of loyalty to Russia becomes more important than loyalty to anything else. So it is Russia that emerges victorious out of the coup. Gorbachev is saved. Gorbachev is coming back. On plane to Moscow, he says, we are coming to a different country, but he really didn't realize to what degree that was true. Within the next 2 days, a counter coup takes place. If before that the hardliners were trying to strip Gorbachev of power and failed, now Yeltsin strips him of power and succeeds. On that day, 22nd of August, Gorbachev signs a decree on appointing his own people, the head of the KGB, the head of the government, and so on and so forth. The next day, on insistence of Yeltsin, he recalls all of these decrees, which were already published in the major newspapers, and appoints people who are loyal to Yeltsin. You read memoirs of Yegor Gaidar, you read memoirs of other people who were involved in that. The model that Yeltsin has at that time was the model of Russia taking over the center, Russia taking over the Soviet Union. And that attempt at taking over the Soviet Union by Russia actually didn't succeed, it failed. The idea was that Yeltsin would replace Gorbachev, that there would be a union in which Russia would play an important role. Not just important role, but the leading role to a degree that it didn't play before. And that, of course, the property rights for oil and gas and things like that would lie with the republics. That means with Yeltsin and not Gorbachev. It didn't work for two reasons. The first one was the position of the United States. Yeltsin was not a popular figure in Washington. He was erratic, unpredictable. It was impossible to figure out what would be his next step. Meanwhile, Bush liked Gorbachev and liked to work with Gorbachev. There was personal good relations, there was respect for him as a political leader, and American administration wanted the Soviet Union to go as long as possible with Gorbachev at its helm. Also for some geopolitical reasons, because Gorbachev was able actually to deliver on the issues of Middle East, on South Africa, so the hot spots at that time in the late Cold War and in American-Soviet relations. So the policy is set already in the summer of 1991 to keep Gorbachev in power as long as possible and to keep the Soviet Union going as long as possible. So that's the American policy that is in place up until few days before the December 1st. December 1st was a Ukrainian referendum, which I'll talk about that a little bit later. So position of the United States was not to allow Yeltsin to take full control over the center. And another position that didn't allow that to happen was the revolt of the republics. The revolt of the republics, which were led now by Ukraine, the second largest republic in the Union, which was controlled, the legislature in Ukraine was controlled by the communists. And immediately after Ukraine declared independence on the 24th of August of 1991, other republics followed the suit and declared independence from the Soviet Union, which in reality was not independence from Gorbachev or the Soviet Union. The independence was from growing in its strength and importance Russia and growing importance of Yeltsin. And it is at that time, in late August of 1991, that we for the first time hear from Yeltsin and from people around him statements that if the republics go, Russia has the right to negotiate the borders. For the first time, Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, Donbass in particular, are mentioned in late August of 1991. In the process of Russian attempt to take over the Union. Again, it didn't work because of the revolt of the republics and because of the position of the United States. That is a scene from the demonstrations around the Ukrainian parliament on the day when Ukrainian parliament declared independence. And very interesting what is said there, that this is praise for Yeltsin and attack on Kravchuk, because Yeltsin was a democratic figure who rebelled against the coup, while Kravchuk was sitting on the fence through the entire this crucial period in the Soviet history. Now, what we have in Kremlin after coup, counter-coup, we have for the first time in Moscow, in Russia, appearance of the dual power. Kremlin in September, October, and November of 91 has two presidents that both claim Kremlin as the place where they work. So one of those presidents is, of course, Yeltsin. Another president is Mikhail Gorbachev. By that time, by October of 91, Russia makes its decision to go its own way when it comes to economy and economic reform. People who are closest to Yeltsin explained to him that we are in the free fall when it comes to economy. Your rating is very high right now after the coup, but if you don't do anything about the economy, your rating will be on the same level where is Gorbachev's, which 4 or 5%. So to stay in power, we have to do something, and we have to do something quite dramatic in terms of the economic reform. They also tell him that now with control over oil and gas, you don't need other republics. And more than that, we don't have money and resources to support other republics. So in economic terms, we should go our way. Otherwise, your presidency and our experiment at liberalism in Russia will be buried. It's not breaking the political union, but it actually saying to every other republic in the union, either you join us in our drastic economic reform, or you are on your own, and we are not responsible for what is happening there. The people around Yeltsin tried to get Gorbachev on board. The model that is discussed at that time is the model of confederation, in which center would basically play role of representation of this confederation. Russia would be the main force there. Of course, for personal reasons, Gorbachev could not agree to the situation and arrangement in which Yeltsin would tell him what to do. And allies advisors to Yeltsin were trying to explain to Gorbachev and to his people, and we know now that from memoirs, they were saying, okay, with the republics, we now don't have resources. Empire is a very expensive thing. We can't do that. We have to use these resources to rebuild Russia. Once Russia is rebuilt, in 20 years, the republics will come back. And if they will not come back, to hell with them, the important thing is to keep the republics which are on our borders. Well, if you look at the map of Russia and the Soviet Union and count the republics on the Russian borders, that would be 90% of all republics. It's an interesting episode that I put into the book not knowing what is coming, but it was really very interesting to find out the origins of that thinking already there. So this is image on the right of Yegor Gaidar, the key person in defining what Russian economic reform will be, and also the key person in convincing Yeltsin that we means Russia don't have money to keep the empire going. It was already at that time, in the fall of '91, that a clear line was drawn between different kind of republics and different kind of successionist movements. The Union republics, meaning Baltic republics, Ukraine, Belarus, despite historical ties, cultural, linguistic, economic, family, whatever, were allowed to go. The autonomous republics would stay. And it was in November of '91 that for the first time the Russian troops are moving into Chechnya. The republic that, in terms of the population, composition of the population, and so on and so forth, is more or less equal to Estonia. And looking at Estonia and Chechnya, again, there are different cultural backgrounds and histories and things like that, but looking at this desire for independence in both republics, which was quite strong, with Chechens prepared to fight for that. Estonians, I don't know whether they would be prepared to do that or not. But again, they're treated very differently because Chechens are autonomous republic within Russian Federation. And Estonia is Union Republic. So the line is drawn that Russia will fight for autonomous republic and for the unity of the Russian Federation. But the other republics can go. The key negotiations take place after the referendum in Ukraine on December 1st, 1991, in which 90%, 90 plus something, of population voted for independence, including in the Crimea, where the vote was 54%, in Sevastopol the vote was 57%. In Donbass area, around 80%. There was no referendum on the end of the Soviet Union. There was one referendum on Ukrainian independence, in which it turned out that Ukrainians voted not just for their independence, but for independence of every other republic. And the question is why? Why Ukrainian referendum became so important? Why the Soviet Union could not keep going and Russia with other republics without Ukraine? Well, Boris Yeltsin twice explained the situation to President Bush, and we know now that from the transcripts of their telephone conversations and personal meetings in Moscow as well. The logic came as a major surprise to me. He said that, well, if Ukraine is not signing the new Union Treaty, Russia is not signing either. Because without Ukraine, and again, in terms of the population, in terms of the economic input, Ukraine was second after Russia, distant second, but second, with 54 million population. Russia had, it seems to me, 150 or something like that, so almost 3 times as many. So it was distant second, but second. Other republics would have 20 million, 15 million, 10 million, and so on and so forth. So Yeltsin says that without Ukraine, Russia will be outvoted and outnumbered by Muslim republics in the new union. He repeated that twice. It struck me as almost like post-9/11 type of thinking, which is there in the documents from the summer and from the fall of '91. So I tried to translate it in a different language and explain that to me. So my reading of that situation and that Russian desire not to go with the Union if Ukraine is not part of that, in a sense that the burden of the empire is heavy already enough. If there is no Ukraine, then Russia is not interested in this project, in this undertaking. And indeed, after the Ukrainian referendum of December 1st, '91, 3 leaders of the republics, Russia in the center, leader of Belarus, and here Ukraine, Mr. Kravchuk, meet in Belovezhe, with Yeltsin starting the negotiation, putting on the table the new Union Treaty prepared by Gorbachev and saying, would you sign it? Kravchuk said, we had a referendum, I was elected a president, I just can't go back to Kiev signing any union agreement. He said, then Russia is not signing either. Let's talk what the new arrangement will be. After Ukrainian referendum, it was a matter of the few weeks before the Soviet Union was dissolved. First, there was a talk about Slavic Union and Muslim Central Asian Union, but by December 20th, 1991, the leaders of all republics met in Almaty and dissolved the Soviet Union. A few days later, Gorbachev stepped down. So let me get back to the question of who killed the Soviet Union. Whether it was the policy of the United States, whether it was tensions between the center and Russia, between Gorbachev and Yeltsin, whether there was communism, whether there was economic collapse. I would say that all of these factors actually contributed to the death of the Soviet Union. So all of these suspects that you see there on their Oriental Express, they all contributed to that. But my key conclusion in the book is that in the final days when it mattered the most, it was the inability of the elites of the 2 largest republics of the Union, Russia and Ukraine, to find modus vivendi within the one structure and within one union. What that meant, that once they decided that they are not joining the union, there was no union anymore. What occurred was actually this domino effect. Ukraine votes for independence and says we are not part of the union. Russia says, if Ukraine is not part of the union, we don't want to be part of that union. The rest of the republics don't want to be part of the union where there is no Russia, including Central Asian republics, because of with most of this republic, because of their dependence on the subsidies coming from the center, which means actually from Russia. And union comes to an end. Again, that was written before these events. I didn't expect that what is happening now would happen. I didn't expect war. I didn't expect annexation. I didn't expect the major international crisis, the deepest, the largest international crisis since the end of the Cold War. But what seems to be stays the same, or importance of factors that were there in '91 and they continue today, is the importance of this Russian-Ukrainian relations. And the importance of Ukraine for any integrationist project on the part of Russia, whether it was '91 or it is 2013 and 2014. Because again, what is happening today and the way how things started, they started over the association agreement, Ukraine association agreement with European Union. And another type of dynamic that repeats itself is that the position that takes Ukraine and then Russia takes position vis-a-vis Ukraine influences the position of every other country and every other state in the post-Soviet space. So we see now Kazakhstan and Belarus are trying actually to back off as much as possible from the projected Eurasian Union with Russia. So the May of 2014 agreements that were signed, again, Ukraine was absent there, of course, for obvious reason, that were signed, they actually didn't meet even maybe 30% of expectations in what was planned before the Ukrainian crisis. So I started to write my book as a book of history. I put it into the context of the disintegration of empires. And I called the book The Last Empire. I truly believed that that story is over, that it's for historians to study. Well, recent events proved me wrong. So the story of the disintegration of the last empire continues. And unfortunately, we are actually witnesses of that process. Thank you very much for your attention. Yes, please.
Yeah, so I want to point one big difference between all the other empires and the two other empires, which one you didn't mention.
Okay.
And that's Russian and Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
Russian and Chinese empires were monolithic. They did not have colonies. They conquered nations around them. And there is still one remaining empire, which is China, which has not undergone dissolution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I know you're specializing in Ukrainian history, of course.
This is a good comment. This is a good comment.
It was an empire. It did have an emperor, and the borders haven't changed except with Taiwan and Hong Kong.
Okay, thank you.
They still claim it.
Sure, thank you. Basically, what you are talking about are the continental empires vis-a-vis maritime empires. And I can add to that group also the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They dreamed about having fleet and having, like anybody else, have colonies. They failed. Hitler's Germany in 1939, with Britain cutting off access to Africa and so on, goes to Eastern Europe, including in Ukraine and Western Russia, to create their own empire there. So there is a number of continental empires, or attempts to create continental empires. Russia, from that point of view, again, as you said, is not unique. With Chinese, I'm actually more cautious, because with Chinese, even with the dominant group and with the dominant nation, from what I understand, is that there is written language like Church Slavonic. But people living in different parts of the country who call themselves Chinese don't understand each other. So with Chinese, for me, is a big question to what degree the model that developed of nation building and disintegration of empires that was built in Europe, including Eastern Europe, that there is language and there is culture, and around it there is a national mobilization, and that provides legitimacy for the state. To what degree this connection between language and culture and state that we know in Eastern Europe work or will not work in China? And again, it's I don't know the answer. I was trained to believe that there are kind of a general laws and rules, and we all would more or less develop along the same lines, but maybe this is not entirely true. Thank you for your question. Yes, please.
Professor Plokhy, thank you for an extremely interesting presentation. You know, I was prepared to hear that the United States didn't play much of a role in the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That was outside of the United States was quite obvious. But I'm extremely impressed by, the detail you gave to the internal dynamics.
Sure,
So my
thanks.
very specific question is about Belovezhskaya Pushcha situation. So it's clear that Ukraine didn't want the Union and Russia decided not. But then
Dropped
you
out.
said there was the second question. Did they really give any consideration to what's next after they decide that? Because the stories are that they were drinking heavily and in the situation of hangover signed those agreements without Yeltsin and I think Kravchuk to not even understanding what they were doing.
Thank you. Excellent question, and gives me an opportunity to talk about something that I wanted to talk but ran out of time. You look at the, I'll not talk about how much they were drinking. Again, it's, we have conflicting comments on that, and also I am not sure what effect that had. But what we know, we have this very specific date of the end of the Soviet Union, which is December 25th, Gorbachev resigns. Well, in my opinion, this is just the beginning of the dissolution and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The process that takes almost 10 years. And I'll provide this, kind of explain that on the Russian-Ukrainian relations after 91. The issue of the nuclear arms was not resolved until 94. The issue of the borders was not resolved until 97, when the Black Sea Fleet was divided and agreement was signed. Russian Parliament, Duma, didn't ratify the 97 agreement until 99. So it was in the last year of Yeltsin's power that issue of borders, the property of the Soviet Union, the issue of the nuclear arms were completely resolved. So in Belovezhsky, we see the beginning, the start of the negotiation process. You can, of course, claim that Yeltsin starts drinking more and more and more, but again, that's the turf in which, I promised not to go. So the process is there is one date that is the beginning, but there is a long process. Now, in terms of Belovezhsky, there are different understandings of what Belovezhsky means and what Commonwealth means. And on March 18th, 2014, President Putin, in his speech on the annexation of the Crimea, says that, well, we in Russia believe that this is just a different name for the Soviet Union. We started to realize what happened only when the Crimea ended up on the other side of the border. Well, my reading of the sources from 91 indicate that he is not lying. You look also at memoirs of people around Yeltsin. They believe that there will be some kind of a state formation with more rights, looser formation, with more rights for the republics. Position of Ukraine and a number of other republics, Uzbekistan in particular, is very different. They look at Commonwealth as an instrument, as they called in Kiev, for civilized divorce. And in the course of the 1990s, there is this why it takes so long. There is really, what is going is this contest between different visions of what the Commonwealth will be. Whether the Commonwealth will be the place that will reintegrate the Soviet space. It never was headed by anyone by the Russian president through its entire history, the Commonwealth. Or the Commonwealth will perform its functions once the issues of the dissolution are resolved. So, and until the end of the 90s, that question was still up in the air. So from that point of view, the process is long, and the process of realization of what is happening and how is happening. Again, this is more than just 1 year or one particular day as December 25th. It is an important day, but still. Yes, please.
Yeah, just two comments, really. Maybe they relate to questions, I'm not sure. One, I would argue, at least in terms of the U.S. government, that the recognition of the Baltic states came in early September.
September 5th, yes.
Yeah, I was there.
Okay.
And then I would also argue that from the U.S. government perspective, the recognition of the independence of the other republics came right after that meeting in December. So December 25th was already gone as far as the U.S. was concerned. They were starting to deal with the republic governments as independents. And secondly, I think you do have to look a little bit more at the role of the Baltic countries in the, in the period before the, let's say, the chicken calf speech and what was going on.
Mhm.
But, things started breaking out in Estonia in really early as 1986.
Well,
Lithuanians declared independence in '89, and the Estonians almost did.
yes. Well, the Baltic story is extremely important for the fall of the Soviet Union. I integrated, again, I start my story in the summer of '91, but I integrate the Baltic story when I write about the events of September of '91 and recognition, American recognition of the independence of Baltic states. We have March '89 Declaration of Independence by Lithuania. And we have blockade by Gorbachev. We have in early '91 use of force. There is a big myth that Gorbachev is not using force. Gorbachev is using force again and again from Georgia to Baltics, so on and so forth. Now, in terms of the position of the administration. In administration, they hate what is going on there. They have a bigger fish to fry. They have to deal with the Middle East. There is the issue of Afghanistan. There is issue of the Soviet assistance to Cuba. They have Gorbachev, finally the person with whom they can work. And those awful bolts create problems for Gorbachev. More than that, they create problems for President Bush because they mobilize the community and they mobilize their supporters in the Congress and in the Senate. To every meeting to which President Bush is going to discuss nuclear disarmament and world issues, the Senate sends a long list demanding independence of the Baltic states. And Bush tries to accommodate Gorbachev till the very end, postponing the recognition of the Baltic independence, which was, with Lithuanian case, it's March '89. With Estonia and Latvia, this is August, in the middle of the coup. And he gets a lot of hit for that. Then he gets a lot of hit for Chicken Kyiv speech. So by the time when Ukrainian referendum comes, there are all these bolts. Ukrainians, East Europeans are marching around and saying, we'll pay you back at the ballot box. Or the Ukrainian newspapers here appear with the headlines, you were the last to recognize the bolts, be the first to recognize Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So the administration, and I don't envy their situation. They're in a very difficult position. But the story of the fall of the Soviet Union and the way how the American policy is calibrated is an excellent case study on the ethnic mobilization and the role of ethnic minorities and ethnic communities in the United States and how they influence American policy, influence or don't influence. So thanks for bringing up the bolts. That's another case where I could talk more, but didn't have time. Yes, please.
That was terrific, and I really enjoyed reading your book. So if we're going to talk about the Baltic states, let's talk about the Balkans, right? Because
Okay.
at the same time, of course, that events were unfolding in the summer of 1991, Slovenia and Croatia had declared independence, and the response, certainly by Belgrade, was war, right? And so I'm just kind of curious in the readings that you've done, did what was unfolding in Yugoslavia, did it perhaps you know, in the Soviet Union, recognizing, again, that to maybe challenge borders in 1991, you know, given what was unfolding in Yugoslavia.
Yes, yes.
I'm really
Yes,
curious
yes,
about
yes,
what was discussed.
Yes, thank you. Well, Yugoslavia is very much on the radar. Again, things start really ugly there, it seems to me, in summer of 91, right? So by the fall of 91, it is very much on the radar of everyone who is involved in deciding the fate of the Soviet Union. And the person who really almost monopolizes this, the Balkan theme, is Mikhail Gorbachev. He is repeating again and again to Bush, to anyone who is prepared to listen, what is happening now will lead to Yugoslavia with nukes. We'll have the Yugoslav scenario. So it's again and again, and from the Ukrainian side, there is a response that by issuing these warnings, he really incites the internal conflicts. What is different, in my opinion, and I think that maybe you are in a better position to judge that, but what is different in Western policy vis-a-vis the disintegration of Yugoslavia and disintegration of the Soviet Union, that in the case of the Soviet Union, the West was speaking with one voice, and that was the voice of Bush. So he did fantastic job sitting on the phone endlessly with everyone, with all leaders. And the policy was really coordinated. With Yugoslavia, it was different. And another thing is that Yeltsin and people around him, they were different from people around Milosevic. So they, at the end, they sent the troops to Chechnya, but they refused to send troops to Kiev. Or one thing is that there was no loyal troops to send after the coup. So that's one thing. There was very little. In Chechnya, it ended up in, they were surrounded by the Chechens and had to be evacuated. So there was no resource. But there was also ideological, those people were different, because my interpretation of how happened the marriage between Russian liberalism and the idea of independent Russia is that this is basically happened by default. At least that's what Burbulis explains. He says that we wanted this liberal project for the entire Soviet Union. But we were outnumbered there by loyal to the Kremlin votes coming from Central Asia. So they decided that they have more votes in the Russian parliament, in the Russian Federation. And you see this kind of a very liberal Gaidar and others and this liberal movement coming together on the platform of the Russian Federation and basically Russian sovereignty. So their origins were not nationalistic per se at the beginning, more liberal. And that, on the top of the fact that they didn't have the troops to send, I think contributed to what happened. What happened back then in 91 and 92. Kozyrev in 92 was Russian from Tajikistan to Moldova, trying to actually stop the Soviet troops from interfering and taking part into those conflicts, being afraid that Russia will be dragged into those conflicts. So those were this kind of a liberal advisors back then in 91, 92. The situation, of course, changed. Thank you for your question.
Should we perhaps take one more question and then end our session? And we'll have, and again, let me just say thank you for coming, and we'll have another opportunity to hear Dr. Plokhy talk more on current events and take questions again tomorrow at beginning 12:30 in Sub Ballroom A, but let's have our final question.
Yes, please.
Have the Russian people had much influence in the political decisions that either, like you say, a referendum in one country, they get to pull out of the Union, but did the people themselves ever have a voice?
Well, people had a voice in 91. In March, Gorbachev organized the all-union referendum. Whether you want, but the question was not clear. Do you want to continue the continuing existence of the union, but the reformed union? But what the heck reformed meant was not clear. So there was one referendum. To what degree? People of Russia in particular, got the opportunity to say what they want during June 91 presidential elections for Yeltsin. So that's where people were asked about whom do you want. They had chosen Yeltsin. After that, it's really the story of negotiation of the people at the high level, international negotiations with Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Bush, Kravchuk, and others getting in. So what you see at that time, people get opportunity to choose their leaders. In Russia, later in Ukraine, in Uzbekistan, whatever that means, who control the elections there. But at least in those republics where democracy meant something and there was already mobilization, they got an opportunity to choose the leaders, and then the leaders were choosing what to do with the union. Okay. Thank you very much for your questions. And if you have time, please come tomorrow.